The house smells like pine and cinnamon, and for a second I'm 20 again, standing in socks on polished wood floors, waiting to be told where to sit. 8 winters have passed since I last crossed this threshold, yet the same silver garland drapes the staircase, and the same porcelain angels line the mantel. My father's voice floats from the dining room, steady and practiced, the sound that organized my childhood into marching orders. My mother adjusts a centerpiece that doesn't need adjusting, eyes down, careful not to catch mine too long. Grant and Tyler hover near the head of the table, trading the small talk of men who believe the room belongs to them. I smooth the chain of my pendant and take the chair someone left at the far end, the one that wobbles if you lean on it. The china is Whitfield white with a thin gold ring, the pattern I grew up washing by hand on Sundays. The carving knife glints under the chandelier as my father lifts his glass and says, "It's time we talk about the future." Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground at a table that forgot your worth, tap like and subscribe, so we can keep each other company. I'm Nora Whitfield, born in a town where winter sticks and work is a language everybody speaks. My parents ran on schedules and Certainty Church at 9 roast in the oven by noon, bills paid the day they arrived. Dad built Whitfield Manufacturing into a reliable name, the kind stamped onto crates and invoices, not magazine covers. Mom kept the house running like a quiet engine, making lists that vanished into clean laundry and full plates. We were taught to say please and thank you, to look people in the eye, to show up early, and leave things better than we found them. Those were good lessons, and I carried them farther than anyone expected me to. I was the kid who liked to take apart radios and put them back together, the one who stayed after school because code felt like a puzzle I could solve with patience and a sharpened pencil. Mrs. Ellison kept the lab open late and let me try things until the screen finally did what I asked. At home, my brothers talked shop with Dad about production lines and equipment upgrades, while I tried to explain neural networks over the clatter of forks and the sports on low in the background. Real business, Dad would say, tapping his napkin against his plate, and the conversation would roll on without me. I learned to tuck my ideas into a notebook and save them for someone who wanted to hear them. The first big move I ever made took me far from the brick office on Mill Street and the steady paychecks it promised. Boston was loud in a way our town wasn't, and later San Francisco felt like somebody turned the dial up 2 more notches. Rent was more than a mortgage back home. Coffee cost what we'd have called a small luxury, but the rooms buzzed with the kind of curiosity I recognized from that school lab. I worked until my eyes burned, slept a little, and worked again. The code didn't care where I was from. It answered to effort and clarity, and both were things I knew how to bring. Family has a way of keeping score even when nobody admits they're doing it. Grant and Tyler had degrees that lined up neatly with Dad's world, and jobs that could be shown off at Rotary lunches. I sent emails about pilot studies and clinical data, and when I called home, the phone sometimes rang through to silence. Mom said she was sure I was doing something interesting, and Dad asked if I'd thought about coming back to help in a practical way. I said I was building something that could help doctors see what they were missing. The line would go quiet, and we'd both pretend we hadn't heard what we didn't want to address. What I carried from that house were the ordinary things you don't notice when you're young. The pride in a tool kept clean, the steadiness of people who show up when they say they will, the belief that if something matters, you stay late and figure it out. Those values fit in my backpack alongside the laptop and the stack of grant applications. They sat with me in empty offices when the sun came up over glass towers and in crowded bus rides when my code refused to compile. When I finally made it through a wall I'd been banging my head against for months, I could hear Mrs. Ellison's patient try again and my mother's wash your hands and set the table braided into a single strand of discipline that felt like home. Coming back for Christmas wasn't a sentimental decision. It was time that's all time to sit in a room that shaped me and see it with clear eyes. The house hadn't changed, but people shift in slow ways and fast ones, and you only notice if you hold still long enough. My brothers stood a little taller under Dad's gaze. Mom's smile held a new tightness at the edges. I took stock of the chairs, the polished wood, the heat rising from the dishes, and the little flutter that started under my ribs when Dad cleared his throat. He lifts his glass and scans the table like an umpire calling a game he's sure he owns. The knife rests in a groove on the board, and the clock over the doorway ticks through a room full of held breaths. "It's time we talk about the future," he says, and the chandelier hums in the quiet. Somewhere under the tablecloth, my knee finds the wobble in the chair and steadies it. I place my fingers lightly on the rim of my water glass and look up. Whatever is coming, I want to hear it said out loud. The knife slides cleanly through the roast, and my father's voice carries across the long table, as if he were delivering a boardroom address. "Whitfield Manufacturing will remain in the family," he says, pausing only to glance at Grant and Tyler. "I'll be stepping back after the first quarter. Grant will serve as chief executive. Tyler will take on operations." He raises his glass in their direction, proud and assured. The words hang in the air with the finality of a contract signed in ink. I keep my eyes on the water glass in front of me, the condensation slipping slowly down the stem. Around me, chairs shift as my brothers straighten their shoulders, the corners of their mouths tugging upward in barely concealed triumph. Mother presses her napkin flat against her lap, careful not to look my way. For a moment, the room is still as though waiting for something unsaid until she clears her throat softly and asks, "And Nora." The sound of my name breaks the quiet like glass on tile. My father sets his fork down with deliberate precision and answers without turning his head. "Nora has chosen her path," he says, his tone clipped and dismissive. "She's off in California chasing gadgets in the tech world. The company belongs with her brothers." His words land as firmly as the edge of the carving knife against the cutting board. Grant's gaze flicks toward me, quick and nervous, before he drops it back to his plate. Tyler stirs his wine, swirling it in slow circles that leave a red trail against the crystal. Neither speaks in my defense, and their silence weighs as heavily as my father's decree. My mother shifts again, smoothing an invisible crease on the tablecloth, but she stays quiet. She has always stayed quiet. 8 years ago, I might have lowered my eyes and let the words settle without argument. Tonight my hands tremble only slightly before I steady them on the edge of the table. I manage a polite nod and say, "Understood." The sound of my own voice surprises me, calm, even measured. My father accepts it as agreement and turns back to his plate, satisfied that the matter is closed. The rhythm of utensils on china resumes a muted soundtrack to the tightening knot in my chest. My mind slips backward to another night in this same room when I returned from Boston with my diploma in hand. I had spoken eagerly about the company I dreamed of building, explaining how neural networks could one day change the way doctors identified neurological disorders. My father had chuckled, then shaking his head with the same certainty he wears now. "That's just tinkering, Nora," he'd told me. "Leave real business to your brothers. Find yourself a good husband instead." That memory presses against me now as I chew and swallow in silence, each bite heavy. The garland twinkles along the staircase, but I feel no warmth in it. Across the table, Grant adjusts his cufflinks while Tyler leans back with practiced ease. They are the heir's apparent polished and presented their value never in question. Mine has always required proof, always weighed and measured against expectations I could never meet. Dessert arrives, the delicate plates passed around with quiet ceremony. Ben nearly drops his fork in his rush to unlock his tablet, eyes widening at the glow of the screen. "Aunt Nora," he blurts, "you're on Forbes!" His voice cracks with excitement, breaking the careful quiet like a stone through glass. He thrusts the tablet forward, the headline clear. "Even from where I sit, NeuroVista acquired for $4.5 billion. Founder Nora Whitfield now worth $2.8 billion. For a heartbeat, the room freezes. Grant's fork clatters against porcelain. Tyler lowers his glass mid-sip, and my mother's hand flies to her throat. My father's eyes lock onto the tablet, scanning the words with disbelief etched across his face. The headline lingers in the air, sharp and undeniable, and for the first time all evening, the balance in the room shifts. He clears his throat, the edge in his voice dulled but not softened. "We'll discuss this in the living room," he says, pushing back from the table. Chairs scrape, feet shuffle, and one by one the family rises. My brothers exchange a look I cannot quite read. My mother gathers her napkin and follows him, her steps quick and anxious. I take my glass of wine with me, steady in hand, and walk behind them toward the portraits that line the hall, each frame a reminder of the years I was left out of the story. In the living room, the air feels heavier. weighted by the silence of generations watching from gilded frames. My father remains standing, glasses perched low on his nose as he turns to me with a frown. "How long were you planning to keep this from us?" His voice is not proud, not curious, but accusing. "I wasn't hiding anything," I reply evenly. "The announcement was made months ago. Anyone could have called." The words taste strange on my tongue, both true and damning. My mother lowers herself into a chair smaller than I remember her eyes fixed on her lap. My father's jaw tightens, the lines around his mouth deepening. "I never thought you'd actually succeed in that world," he says. "I was protecting you from disappointment." His tone carries the same certainty as always, but the weight behind it feels thinner now. From the doorway, Grant clears his throat. His words stumble as they leave him. "I should have told you. Years ago, Nora came to me for seed money. I turned her down. Dad said it wasn't wise to encourage dreams that wouldn't last." My chest tightens at the memory. Those months when one small loan might have made the difference between survival and collapse. I meet his eyes and say nothing, the silence more cutting than any accusation. "What about my letters?" I ask softly, turning toward my mother. "The ones I sent every Christmas for 3 years." Her eyes drop lower, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Your father thought it best not to answer until you came to your senses." I intercepted them. The room stills around us. The fire crackles faintly in the hearth, its warmth lost in the cold that settles between us. The betrayal folds over itself in layers, each revelation pressing harder than the last. My father waves a hand, dismissing the headline once more. "These tech valuations never hold," he insists. "The numbers will fall, and then what will you have?" Tyler shifts his weight uncomfortably. "Dad's right," he says, but his voice lacks conviction. "These bubbles always burst." Grant's tone sharpens in contrast, suddenly bright. "We always knew you had potential, Nora. Remember when I helped you with your computer homework in high school?" His smile strains, as if willing me to agree. The memory rises clear as day, his hand sliding my assignment into his folder, the two of us standing in detention together. I hold his gaze until his words falter. My mother rushes to fill the silence. "I've always told people how proud we are of you. I knew you'd do well." Her voice is almost pleading, a story rewritten mid-sentence. My father nods quickly, seizing the thread. "That drive for success, you get that from me." He says it as though ownership of my life's work can be claimed in a single breath. The audacity hangs between us, thick as smoke. For a moment the temptation rises to accept this sudden rewrite of history, to let their words smooth over the years of silence. But the vibration of my phone breaks through the screen, lighting up with a message from Mrs. Ellison. "I always knew you'd change the world, Nora. Proud of the girl who stayed after class to learn when everyone else had gone home." Her words reach where theirs cannot. She saw me then, as I was not as they wished to remember. And as I slip the phone back into my pocket, I know the story isn't finished yet. The fire crackles on the family, waiting for me to nod and fall into line, but my hands rest steady on the arm of the chair. Tomorrow, the truth will have its own place at this table. The house grew quiet after the argument in the living room, but the stillness did little to soften what I carried upstairs. I found myself back in the bedroom I'd left years earlier, where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung stubbornly to the ceiling. Lying there, I remembered nights when exhaustion blurred into determination, the years when I balanced 3 jobs just to keep tuition paid at MIT. My hands never seemed free of the smell of disinfectant and fried food, yet those long shifts were the only way forward once my father refused to help. I could still see the rejection letters scattered across my dorm bed, each one marked in red, each one reminding me that no one wanted to take a chance on my ideas. I cried quietly, then certain I had reached the end of the road. But it was a single message that changed everything, an email from a father in Detroit whose young daughter had been misdiagnosed 3 times. My algorithm caught what the specialists had missed, a rare form of epilepsy that could be treated. He wrote, "You gave my daughter her life back." I printed his words, folded them into my wallet, and carried them through the hardest days until the paper softened at the edges. A knock on the door pulled me back to the present. When I opened it, Harper stood there clutching her laptop against her chest. At 13, she had her father's height, but not his practiced confidence. My computer science teacher assigned this project," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. "I thought maybe you could help. I want to be like you, not like them." For the first time since I'd arrived, my smile came easily. I invited her in, and together we sat cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through her lines of code. Her work was clumsy in spots, but bright with possibility, and the way her face lit up when she fixed an error reminded me of who I once was. Later that evening, I walked downstairs to my father's office. The room smelled of leather and old paper, unchanged in all the years I'd been gone. Models of farm equipment lined the shelves, and awards from industry associations filled the walls. He sat behind the same mahogany desk, reading glasses perched low on his nose, his expression carefully neutral when I entered. "You wanted to see me," I said, keeping my tone steady. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. "I've been thinking about what happened at dinner. I only wanted to protect you. The tech world is brutal. 9 out of 10 startups fail. I didn't want you to be disappointed." The words sounded familiar, excuses I had heard dressed in different clothes for most of my life. I felt something sharpen inside me as I answered, "You weren't protecting me. You were silencing me." His eyes widened slightly, unused to the challenge. "Every time I shared an idea, you dismissed it as playing with gadgets. When I graduated with honors, you suggested I find a husband instead of building a company. That wasn't protection, Dad. That was control." He started to respond, but I held my ground. "I never needed your permission to succeed. I thought I needed it to feel worthy of success. There's a difference." The silence that followed seemed to press against the wood-paneled walls. For once, my father had no words ready. My thoughts drifted then to Mrs. Ellison, the teacher who stayed late to help me apply for scholarships behind my father's back. She had told me my mind was exceptional, that I should never let anyone convince me otherwise. Remembering her voice gave me strength in that office where, for the first time, I felt taller than the man who had defined my limits. I turned toward the door and paused. "There's a family dinner tomorrow," I said. "I think it's time everyone heard the real story." Upstairs, I opened my laptop and pulled up the recordings from the past 2 days, my father's boasts of guiding me, his claims of steady support, the rewrites of history spoken without hesitation. I saved them into a folder labeled Truth and closed the lid. From the hallway, I heard him call the family together once more. The clink of glasses carried up the staircase as he lifted a toast to my successful daughter who followed my advice. I stepped into the room, wineglass in hand, and raised it in return. "To family," I said, pausing just long enough to catch his eye, and to Truth. The faces around the table turned toward me, waiting for more. Tomorrow I would give it to them, every detail laid bare, each silence broken. Tonight I let the words settle in the air, knowing the reckoning was closer than anyone expected. The dining room felt charged the next evening, the chandelier casting a glow over faces that waited for another toast. My father lifted his glass again, repeating words he had said the night before. "To my successful daughter, who followed my advice." The crystal chimed as relatives raised their glasses. I mirrored his gesture, letting the silence draw just long enough before I spoke. "To family," I said, and then with my eyes steady on his, "and to Truth." The room grew still, every movement pausing as though someone had pressed a hidden button. I set my glass down, the soft click of crystal against china, sharper than it should have been. My breath came easily, and for once I felt no need to rush. 8 years ago I stood in this room with my MIT diploma. It was June 4th, 2017. My father shifted in his chair, but I continued, my voice calm and deliberate. I explained an idea I had, how neural networks could help doctors catch diseases before they became untreatable. I looked toward Grant. "I asked you that summer to co-sign a loan. July 15th. You said no. Every bank turned me away. I worked 3-job Starbucks on Cooper Avenue from 5 in the morning until noon, tech support from 1 to 6, and freelance coding until 2. My mother's fork stilled in midair, her eyes widening slightly. I did that for 18 months until November of 2019, when Dr. Alan Mercer invested. By 2022, our platform had diagnosed early-stage neurological conditions in over 4,000 patients. Across the table, Aunt Linda leaned toward Uncle Dennis and whispered, though she wasn't quiet enough. I pressed on my rhythm steady. Last month, NeuroVista was acquired for $4.5 billion. That headline everyone saw wasn't luck, and it wasn't marriage. It was years of work when no one in this house believed in me. My father cleared his throat, color rising to his face. Nora, I always believed in you. You were young, that's all. I didn't want to see you disappointed. His words came out strained, unconvincing. Grant shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the tension. That's not true. Dad told us not to give you money or connections. He said if we helped you, we'd be cut from the will. The air thickened as Tyler's fork clattered against his plate. Grant, he hissed. What are you doing? All eyes turned to my mother. Her lips trembled as she spoke. I intercepted your letters because your father told me to. He said if we let you fail, you'd appreciate family more. Her hands shook as she set her glass down. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away from me. Gasps and murmurs rippled around the table. Aunt Linda pushed her chair back abruptly. Gordon, you told us Nora refused your help. Years of carefully woven stories began to unravel in real time, the voices rising over one another. I let the noise swell before I spoke again. Every time I was told no, I kept working. And every time you erased me from the story, I wrote a new one for myself. My phone buzzed the screen lighting with a name I hadn't thought of in years, Evan Brooks. 3 years of my life, tied to someone who once told me my dreams were cute but unrealistic. The message read, "Saw you in Forbes. Always knew you had potential." Coffee sometime I turned the phone so my cousin Megan could see. She rolled her eyes, whispering, "Unbelievable." Without hesitation, I typed back, "Thanks, but I prefer to leave the past in the past." I pressed send, while the table fell silent again. It was a small act, but in that moment, it said everything that needed saying. Aunt Linda broke the quiet with a change of subject. "You had Thanksgiving with the governor last month, didn't you? Joanne saw the photos?" I nodded. "His daughter's hospital uses our platform. It caught signs of a stroke early. It saved his life." My father's hands folded tightly together, his knuckles pale. When he looked up, his eyes were damp. "I was wrong about you," he said, voice catching on the final word. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than I had ever heard from him. Around the table, the mood shifted. Aunt Linda placed a hand on my shoulder as she passed. Uncle Dennis leaned forward, asking about how the technology worked. Cousins who had barely looked at me the day before listened intently, their questions genuine. The energy in the room felt unsteady but different, like a wall had cracked and light was seeping through. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. "Maybe it's time for a real family meeting," I said evenly. "One where we discuss how to move forward." My father nodded slowly, his voice low but clear. That would be appropriate. It was not reconciliation, not yet, but for the first time in years, I sensed the possibility. The table where I had once been dismissed now held space for something more honest. What we did with that space would be the next test. The night ended with soft voices instead of slammed doors. As I rose from the table, I carried the knowledge that tomorrow would bring its own maneuvering its own bargains. My family might have admitted fragments of truth, but whether they could live by them was still uncertain. And as I stepped back into the quiet hallway lined with portraits that once excluded me, I knew the real test of change was only beginning. 2 weeks passed before my father called me into his office again. The same mahogany desk separated us, the same framed photographs of my brothers at graduations and boardrooms hung around the walls. But this time, a folder sat in the center of his desk, its corners neatly aligned. He slid it toward me with an expression that tried to appear lighthearted. "We've been talking," he said, "and we think Whitfield Manufacturing should reflect all of our children." I opened the folder and found new letterhead, glossy and formal, with Whitfield and Daughter Manufacturing written across the top in deep navy print. Grant and Tyler flanked him, their shoulders squared, but their eyes darting nervously. "We've already mocked up brochures," Grant said, gesturing toward a stack on the corner. Tyler added, "The announcement goes out next week. The board thinks your profile could help attract new investors." My father leaned back, watching me closely. "You've done well, Nora. Imagine what your expertise and resources could do here with us. It's time we built together." I traced a finger over the raised lettering, letting the weight of their sudden inclusion settle before I closed the folder. "I appreciate the thought," I said quietly. Relief softened my father's shoulders as he began to nod. "Good," he said quickly. Then we'll schedule the press conference for... I looked up. I didn't say yes. The words cut through the room like a blade. Silence stretched across the desk. My father blinked, startled, while my brothers shifted uncomfortably. I said I appreciated the thought. I repeated, rising from my chair. The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the pause that followed. My mother, seated near the window, clasped her hands together, her gaze moving anxiously between us. I opened my laptop and turned it toward them. On the screen was a newly launched website with bold letters reading, "The Whitfield Innovation Fund." Photographs of women in hard hats, lab coats, and business attire filled the banner. This, I said, is where my next chapter is going. $10 million to support women in STEM and manufacturing here in Nebraska. We're already accepting applications for our first grants. Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came. Tyler gripped the arm of his chair. My mother whispered, $10 million. Her voice was so faint it barely carried. To start, I confirmed, closing the laptop gently. The companies these women build will change more than one family's future. They'll create jobs, technologies, entire markets. My father's expression hardened, his tone returning to the one that had ruled my childhood. The family business is not something you cast aside for charity projects. His words were sharp, but I kept my voice even. It's not charity, it's investment. I turned toward my mother, whose eyes widened at the shift of attention. And I'd like you to join the board, Mom. We meet quarterly, and you'd have a vote on all funding decisions. The carving knife my father had been holding clattered against the table. Lorraine doesn't know the first thing about business, he sputtered. My eyes stayed on hers. She raised 3 children, kept this household running, managed finances, organized events, and built connections that supported Whitfield manufacturing for decades. That is business. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she set down her glass with deliberate care. I accept, she said softly, but her words landed like a stone dropped into still water. My father's face darkened, his jaw twitching. Lorraine, he warned, but she straightened her back. It's time I had a voice too, Gordon. Dinner that night was subdued, the weight of new fault lines heavy in the room. Grant stared at his plate, pushing food around with his fork. Tyler tried small talk that faltered almost immediately. My mother ate with surprising steadiness, her appetite stronger than I'd seen in years. My father's silence stretched long between us, broken only by the scrape of cutlery. Weeks later, rumors reached me through colleagues in the city. My father had started seeing Dr. Peter Lowell, a therapist known for working with men in positions of power. When Clayton mentioned it during a video call, his voice was casual, as though he were commenting on the weather. People can change, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. At least that's what Dad's trying to learn. I thought of my mother calling me in the evenings, asking questions about board procedures, practicing Robert's Rules of Order, until her voice grew confident. I thought of the first grant recipient, a woman designing biodegradable packaging, crying tears of joy when we told her she had been chosen. Each small step felt like the beginning of a new foundation, one not built on exclusion. The day before I left for a conference in Boston, the phone rang. My father's voice on the other end sounded different, less certain, more human. Nora, he said my name awkward in his mouth. Will you come back next Christmas? The question hung in the silence between us. I glanced at the calendar on my office wall, the boxes already filled with plans for the next year. I'll think about it. I answered, and for the first time I meant it. That winter, the drive up the familiar Whitfield lane felt different. Through the windshield, I saw them waiting on the porch, my brothers, my mother, and my father, whose stance was less rigid than before. My mother waved with genuine warmth, her movements unguarded. Harper came running down the steps, her tablet pressed tight to her chest. Aunt Nora, she called breathlessly, I need to show you something. Inside the house was dressed the same for Christmas, but the air no longer carried the sharpness of unsaid resentments. Harper pulled me into a corner, opening her laptop to show a program she had written. The code was messy, but the spark was there. Mom said computers are for boys, she whispered, but then I saw your TED Talk. I put my arm around her shoulders. Keep going, I told her quietly. The world needs your mind. Grant greeted me with a handshake that turned into a hesitant hug. Tyler lingered longer than usual, his eyes carrying an apology he hadn't yet found words for. When we sat down to dinner, my father carved the turkey with steadier hands than the year before. He lifted his glass and said, "I want to toast my children, each of them successful in their own way. I'm proud of all of you." The words once would have felt like oxygen. Now I accepted them with a calm smile, warmed but not defined by them. My mother leaned across the table, her eyes bright. "The neural interface you developed for stroke patients," she said. "The Times called it revolutionary." I explained the technology without shrinking my voice, carrying easily through the room. The doorbell chimed. I rose to answer it and opened the door to find Mrs. Ellison holding a bottle of wine. Her posture was still straight, her presence as steady as it had been when I was a teenager in her classroom. I welcomed her inside, introducing her to the cousins who remembered her name as clearly as I did. Later, when the glasses were refilled, I stood with mine lifted high. To those who see our potential when we can't see it ourselves. Mrs. Ellison blinked quickly, her glasses fogging slightly, while my father nodded slowly, a trace of humility softening his features. The evening carried on with quiet laughter, questions about work, and Harper leaning against me as she scrolled through her code. It wasn't the family of my childhood, nor the one I had faced on my return. It was something new, fragile but real, born of truth, finally spoken. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about how much had changed since the toast that started it all. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more negotiations, but for the first time in years, the possibility of a future built on honesty felt within reach. And I knew the next step would test whether this fragile shift could hold. 2 weeks after that Christmas gathering, I returned to my father's office, where the leather chairs and polished wood looked as unyielding as ever. He was waiting with Grant and Tyler already seated, their faces carefully neutral. A folder lay on the desk, and my father slid it toward me with the kind of ceremony he once reserved for contracts. "We've been rethinking the company's image," he said, his tone almost rehearsed. I opened the folder and saw a glossy mock-up of new letterhead, Whitfield and Daughter Manufacturing, the words pressed in navy ink. Grant gestured toward a stack of brochures. "We've printed materials already. The announcement's set for next week." Tyler added quickly, "The board believes your reputation could draw in new investors. This could be good for all of us." My father leaned back, watching my expression. "You've done well on your own," he said, "but think about what we could accomplish together as a family." The weight of the paper pressed against my fingertips, but I closed the folder with a quiet snap. "I appreciate the thought," I said, my voice calm. Relief spread across my father's face. "Good," he said quickly. "Then we'll move forward," I interrupted. "I didn't say yes." The room stilled. My father blinked, confused. "I said I appreciated the thought," I repeated, rising from the chair. Their eyes followed me as I set my laptop on the desk and opened a page I had built with care. The banner read, "The Whitfield Innovation Fund." Photographs of women in hard hats, lab coats and suits stretched across the screen. "This," I explained, "is where my energy is going. $10 million to fund women in STEM and manufacturing across Nebraska. Applications are already open." Grant's mouth tightened. Tyler rubbed the back of his neck. My mother sat by the window, her hand trembling slightly around her glass. $10 million, she whispered. "To start?" I confirmed. "These companies will shape the future of American manufacturing not by borrowing someone else's legacy, but by building their own." My father's voice sharpened. "The family business is real work. That fund is a nice gesture, but it isn't serious." I turned toward my mother. "I'd like you on the board, Mom. You'd have a vote on every grant." Her water glass paused halfway to her lips, and my father nearly shot out of his chair. "Lorraine doesn't know the first thing about business." I didn't look at him. She raised 3 children, managed the household finances, organized events, and built connections this company benefited from for decades. That is business. My mother's eyes filled, her lips pressed together as if holding back years of unsaid words. Then she set her glass down firmly. "I accept," she said. The knife in my father's hand clattered onto the plate. His voice dropped low. "Lorraine." She straightened her shoulders square. "It's time I had a voice too, Gordon." The room held its breath. Grant stared down at his plate. Tyler cleared his throat but found no words. Dinner passed with the scrape of utensils and very little else. In the weeks that followed, I heard through colleagues that my father had begun seeing Dr. Peter Lowell, a therapist who worked with men in leadership. Tyler mentioned it during a video call, his eyes flicking away from the screen. "At least he's trying," he muttered. I thought of my mother phoning me with questions about bylaws and board votes, her voice growing stronger each time. And I thought of the woman we'd chosen as our first grant recipient crying when she heard the news that her biodegradable packaging startup had been funded. Not long after the phone rang in my San Francisco office, my father's voice was softer than I remembered. "Nora," he said, stumbling slightly over my name, "will you come home next Christmas?" His question lingered on the line, fragile and unsteady. I looked at the calendar on the wall, already marked with conferences and deadlines. "I'll think about it," I answered. This time it was true. That December I pulled into the long driveway again. Through the windshield I saw them gathered on the porch. My mother waved broadly, and beside her my father stood with a posture less rigid, his silver hair catching the winter light. Harper came running, clutching her laptop. "Aunt Nora, I want to show you something." She opened it in the living room, her program messy, but alive with promise. "Mom told me computers were for boys," she whispered. "But then I watched your TED Talk." I squeezed her shoulder. "Keep going," I told her. "The world needs your mind." Grant shook my hand before pulling me into a brief, awkward hug. Tyler lingered, his expression softened by words he hadn't yet spoken. At dinner, my father carved the turkey with steady hands. He raised his glass and said, "To my children, each of them successful in their own way, I'm proud of you." The words landed differently now. My mother smiled across the table. "The neural interface you built for stroke patients," she said. "The Times called it groundbreaking." I explained the work without hesitation, my voice carrying through the room. Then the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Mrs. Ellison stood there, her posture still teacher straight, a bottle of wine in her hand. "Later glasses raised," I said. "To those who see our potential when we can't see it ourselves." Mrs. Ellison blinked quickly, her glasses fogging as she smiled. My father nodded slowly, something humbler in the gesture than I had ever seen before. The evening ended with laughter around the table, Harper leaning against me as she scrolled through her code. The house hadn't changed much, but the air inside it had. What came next would test whether these shifts could last, whether the walls built over decades could truly hold new foundations. And as I lay awake that night, I knew the moment of decision was close. The weeks that followed felt different from any I had known in that house. My father kept his appointments with Dr. Lowell, and while the changes were slow, they were visible. He no longer barked orders at the dinner table, and his tone with my mother had softened. During our calls, Tyler mentioned it with cautious hope, as though he didn't want to jinx something fragile. "Dad's really trying," he said one afternoon, his voice quieter than usual. "It's strange, but good. He listens more now." At the same time, the Innovation Fund was taking root. My mother had thrown herself into her new role as a board member, calling me late at night to discuss applications. She kept a notebook filled with questions, her handwriting precise. "Robert's rules say motions require a second," she told me one evening, her voice carrying a mix of nerves and pride. "I want to get it right." Hearing her so determined made me smile. For the first time, she wasn't just standing beside someone else's decisions, she was making her own. The first round of grants went out that spring. One recipient, a young woman named Elise, was developing biodegradable packaging that could replace plastic containers in restaurants. When I called to share the news, her voice broke. This means everything, she said. I thought I'd have to shut down. I set the phone down afterward and sat quietly knowing this was the kind of work that would outlast me. By summer, the fund had its first public event. My mother stood at the podium in a navy suit, her voice strong as she announced the winners. My father sat in the front row, his posture straighter than I'd seen in years, but his expression carried something new restraint. He clapped at the right moments, though the spotlight no longer rested on him. Grant and Tyler stayed near the back, blending into the crowd, no longer quite so certain of their place. That fall, I returned to Nebraska for a short visit. Harper greeted me with her laptop, eager to show me her newest project. "It's a basic game," she explained, "but it runs without crashing." She beamed when the screen lit up her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I want to enter the state coding competition next year." Watching her reminded me of myself at that age, but with something I hadn't had encouragement. My mother stood behind her, nodding with approval. One evening after dinner, my father asked me to step outside. The air was sharp with the bite of early frost. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Nora, I know I can't rewrite the past. I've been thinking about what legacy really means. Maybe it's not just about the business." His hands were clasped together, fingers twitching against each other. "Maybe it's about whether the people you love still want you in their lives." I looked at him carefully, the man who had once measured my worth in dismissals. His words didn't erase what had been done, but they carried weight. "It's a start," I said simply. He nodded, his breath clouding in the cold. "I'm still learning," he admitted, and that was enough for the moment. Later that night, Grant approached me in the hallway. He shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "The company's facing a problem with one of our suppliers," he said. "I thought maybe you'd have advice." His tone lacked the bravado I remembered. It was tentative, almost humble. Tyler joined him, nodding. "We could use your perspective," he added. For the first time, they weren't demanding or dismissive. They were asking. I gave them a few suggestions, simple steps to stabilize operations, and they listened without interruption. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a different way of speaking to each other. At Christmas, the house was full again. My father carved the turkey and raised his glass, but this time he didn't claim credit or make declarations. "To my children," he said, each carving their own path. My mother raised her glass with a steady hand, her eyes meeting mine across the table. Harper leaned against me, whispering about her new coding competition. Mrs. Ellison sat near the fire, chatting with cousins who remembered her as clearly as I did. At one point, she turned to me, smiling. "I told you, Nora, your mind would take you places." I nodded, my throat tightening. Her belief had carried me farther than my family's doubts ever could. The evening ended with laughter, soft and unforced, the kind that once felt impossible in those walls. The air in the house was lighter now, though the past still lingered in quiet ways. My father stayed seated longer than usual, listening instead of leading, and when he rose to say goodnight, he placed a hand gently on my mother's shoulder. That night, as I packed my bag, I thought about how far we had come. Justice hadn't arrived in the form of revenge or punishment. It had come through boundaries, through steady truth, and through the quiet shifts of people finally willing to change. Yet even in the warmth of that evening, I knew there was one more lesson waiting a choice about what mattered most in the end. Spring sunshine streamed through the windows of my San Francisco office as I adjusted the camera for our weekly workshop. 30 teenage girls from rural Nebraska filled the screen, their faces bright with energy, each eager to learn. Harper sat near the corner, already helping the girl beside her debug a line of code. Watching her explain step by step reminded me of myself years ago, except she had something I never did at her age, support at home, and a voice that encouraged her. Nico leaned into the doorway, holding a folder close to his chest. "The investors are here, Aunt Nora," he said. At 15, his summer internship had already taught him lessons that no business textbook could cover. He gave me a quick grin before disappearing down the hall. On my desk, a new family portrait from Easter rested in a silver frame. My mother stood tall, confidence radiating in her stance, while my father stood beside me, not in front, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Grant and Tyler flanked us, their postures less rigid, their smiles less rehearsed. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was a truer one than any that had hung on the walls of our childhood home. I thought about that long dining table where the fight had begun, where silence had cut as sharply as words. Justice hadn't come through anger or punishment. It had come through drawing firm boundaries, through refusing to let history be rewritten, and through giving my mother and the next generation a chance to stand taller than the ones before them. The company my father clung to would always carry his name, but the fund I built was proof that legacies don't have to be inherited, they can be created. That night, after the workshop ended and the office lights dimmed, I sat alone for a while, letting the quiet settle around me. I thought of Mrs. Ellison, who once stayed late so I could finish scholarship applications. I thought of Elise, whose biodegradable packaging now supplied dozens of restaurants, and the father in Detroit, whose little girl had been saved by an early diagnosis years ago. The threads of all these lives wove together into something stronger than any single company or last name could hold. When I returned to Nebraska the following Christmas, the driveway was lined with fresh snow. This time there was no hesitation in the welcome on the porch. My mother rushed forward first, her arms open wide. My father stood just behind her, waiting his turn, his eyes holding something closer to humility than pride. Inside, the tree glowed softly in the corner, while cousins and nieces crowded around the piano. Harper tugged at my sleeve, eager to show me the coding award she had won. My father raised a glass that evening, his words simple. To my children, he said, his voice steady, and to the future they're building. The toast landed differently than any he had given before. I no longer needed his recognition, but I could still accept it. The weight of craving had lifted, leaving only the warmth of acknowledgement. Around the table, laughter came easily, and I felt something I hadn't felt in that house for years: peace. Looking back now, I see the lesson clearly. We can't choose the family we are born into, but we can choose the boundaries we draw and the legacy we create. Justice isn't always about winning battles or proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's about standing firmly in your truth, refusing to be erased, and building something that outlives resentment. And so, as I sit here tonight, I want to leave you with this thought. Hold on to the people who see you when no one else does. Invest your energy where it multiplies. And remember that your worth never depends on someone else's permission. If you've ever had to carve out your own place at a table that tried to push you aside, I'd love to hear your story. Share where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep walking through these journeys together.